Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It was one of those evenings when the air felt thick with the promise of something, though I couldn't say exactly what. The sun had just dipped behind the hills outside our little town in Vermont, and the golden afterglow clung to the windows, casting a honied hue over the living room. I was finishing up the dishes, the soft clatter of plates and the distant hum of the radio filling the quiet house, when the doorbell rang. I dried my hands and called out to my husband, Roger, but he was already halfway up the stairs to change. "Can you get that, Em?" he said over his shoulder. I opened the door, and there he was, David Monroe. The name took a second to click, but the face was unmistakable. Time had softened his features, but hadn't erased the charm he carried even back in the stories Roger used to tell. I remembered their old office Christmas parties, the one where David brought that homemade eggnog everyone raved about. We hadn't seen him in nearly 12 years. "Emily," he said with that boyish smile, his voice warm like an old song you forgot you loved. "It's been far too long." I smiled and opened the door wider. "It certainly has. Come in, come in. You'll have to forgive the mess. We weren't expecting company tonight." David stepped inside, tall and slightly graying at the temples, dressed in a charcoal sweater and slacks. He looked like someone who had learned to wear his years gracefully. As Roger came down the stairs, the two men embraced like brothers who hadn't seen each other in decades. The energy between them filled the room almost instantly. We settled into the living room, and I poured some wine while the two of them caught up. At first, it was the usual small talk: jobs, travel, the aches and adjustments of middle age. But as the evening wore on, the conversation deepened, as if David had brought with him something we didn't know we were missing. At one point, Roger excused himself to take a call from his brother. David and I were left alone. It was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant chirping of crickets outside the window. I glanced at David, and he was looking at the family pictures on the shelf. Our boys, both grown now, one living in Chicago and the other out in Oregon. "You and Roger built a beautiful life," he said gently, nodding at a photo from our anniversary trip to Maine. "You always had that grounded kind of grace. I remember it even back then." The compliment caught me off guard. I felt the corners of my lips lift, but I also felt something else, a flutter, maybe. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me that way, spoke to me that way. Roger loved me, of course, but decades of shared routines and quiet familiarity tend to soften the sharp edges of intimacy. "Thank you," I said, suddenly aware of how close he was sitting. "That's kind of you to say." He leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting on his knee. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, Emily, but I used to wonder. If things had turned out differently, would we have ever?" He stopped himself and chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sorry, that's too much. Forget I said anything." I didn't answer right away. My heart was thudding in my chest, not from alarm, but from something more delicate: curiosity, nostalgia. I looked at him, really looked, and in that moment I saw not just David, but the space he filled, a space I hadn't even known was empty. Roger came back then, cheerfully unaware, and the evening resumed its course. We ate a light dinner, and the conversation remained easy, if slightly more measured. But under the surface, something had shifted. David didn't stay late. When he stood to leave, he hugged Roger and then turned to me. His arms wrapped around me in a way that lingered just a second too long, not enough to be noticed, but enough to be felt. As I closed the door behind him, I stood there for a moment, hand still on the knob. The house was quiet again, but I wasn't. My thoughts were swirling, echoing with something I couldn't quite name. That night, lying beside Roger in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, the outline of David's face lingering in the shadows of my mind. I didn't feel guilty, not exactly. I felt stirred, awake in a way I hadn't been in a very long time. The next morning, I found David's business card on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't planning to do anything with it, but I didn't throw it away either. Over the following weeks, something in me changed. I began to pay attention again, to myself, to what I wore, to the way I spoke, moved, thought. I started walking more, taking time to breathe, to feel the air on my skin. I began writing in a journal again, something I hadn't done since my 30s. Then one Friday morning, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Would you like to meet for coffee? Just to catch up." It was signed, David. My heart skipped. I stared at it for a moment, then put the phone down. But I didn't delete the message. "That afternoon," I replied. "Sure. Coffee sounds nice." We met at a quiet little cafe tucked away behind the old bookstore downtown, the kind of place with chipped mugs and faded curtains, where no one was in a rush. We sat at a corner table, sunlight filtering in through the lace curtains. He looked the same, maybe a little more tired, but his eyes still had that spark. We talked for hours, about everything, about nothing, about our spouses, our regrets, our children, the strange passage of time. There was nothing flirtatious, no overt suggestion. But there was something between us, a thread of understanding, a sense of being seen in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. At one point I asked, "Why now? After all these years?" He looked down at his cup and then back at me. "Because I couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like to talk to you like this, just once, and maybe because I needed to feel a little more alive." I understood that more than I wanted to admit. I didn't tell Roger about the coffee, not because I was hiding something, but because I didn't know what to call it. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't even a secret. It was a moment, a door that opened just a crack to remind me there were still parts of myself I hadn't looked at in a long time. A week later, David sent another message. "This may be bold, but I'm going to be in town again next Thursday. Would you walk with me?" And that's how it began, slowly, gently, with steps that felt innocent on the surface, but carried weight beneath. Each time we met, we talked more deeply. He told me about his failed marriage, about the loneliness that crept in despite full calendars and social smiles. I told him about the quiet aches of long-term comfort, the way I sometimes felt like a ghost in my own life. There was no rush, no pressure, just a slow unraveling of thoughts and feelings that had been coiled up for years. And then one evening, as we walked beside the river just before sunset, he reached out and touched my hand. I didn't pull away. I looked at him, and he looked at me. And in that silence, everything changed. Ask ChatGPT. I didn't sleep much that night. Roger lay beside me, breathing evenly, unaware that my heart was wide awake, fluttering with something I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just about David. It was about what he stirred in me. The way his gaze lingered not on my appearance, but on something deeper. It had been so long since I felt truly seen. I woke early, before the sun rose, and stood barefoot in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The sky was turning from indigo to that soft lavender blush it only wears in early morning. I watched the light grow across the backyard, tracing the outlines of the trees, the worn garden chairs, the old swing Roger had put up when the boys were young. Everything was familiar, safe, predictable. But now that predictability didn't comfort me like it used to. It felt like something I was standing inside of, looking out. David had sent another message that morning, just a simple, "Good morning. I hope today treats you gently." There was nothing inappropriate in it, yet it lingered all day. I read it 3 times before I even replied. "You too, David. Be well." And that could have been the end of it, but it wasn't. That weekend, Roger had a conference in Boston. He offered to take me along, but I told him I'd rather stay home, use the quiet time to catch up on reading. He kissed my forehead before leaving. "Don't forget to water the orchids," he said with a smile. I nodded and smiled back, but inside, I was somewhere else entirely. Later that day, I went to the little cafe again, not because David asked, he hadn't, but because I hoped. And somehow he was there. He stood when he saw me. "Emily," he said, and his voice alone warmed something deep inside me. "I didn't expect to see you today." "I wasn't sure I'd come," I admitted, sitting down across from him. But I didn't want to sit in silence all weekend either. That afternoon turned into evening. The conversation shifted from surface memories to quieter truths. He told me about a poem he'd written that he never shared with anyone. I told him about the short stories I used to write, tucked away in a drawer no one ever opened. Somewhere between our second cups and shared laughter, he reached out again, not for my hand this time, but for a strand of hair that had fallen across my cheek. He brushed it back gently, like a breeze might. "Forgive me," he said, his hand pulling away. "I don't mean to cross a line." I didn't move. I just looked at him. "I don't know where the line is anymore," I said softly. "All I know is, I don't want to lie to myself." He nodded. "Neither do I." We didn't touch again that evening. We didn't kiss. But something passed between us that felt more intimate than either of those things. A recognition, a confession without words. When I got home, the house felt quieter than usual. I turned off the lights and stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at myself, noticing the lines at the corners of my eyes, the way my skin sagged just a little at my jawline. But I also noticed the softness in my gaze, the faint color in my cheeks. I looked alive. Roger called from the hotel. We talked about his day, about dinner with the keynote speaker, about how the room had no view. I told him I'd spent the day reading and doing laundry. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole story. The next week, David invited me to his house. "I made something I think you'd like," he said. "No pressure. Just, if you feel like it." I didn't answer immediately, but the idea of saying yes felt less dangerous than it used to. It felt inevitable. When I arrived, he greeted me at the door with a warmth that didn't try to prove anything. The smell of roasted vegetables and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen. Music played softly. Jazz, I think, or something close to it. Everything about the space felt like him. Understated, thoughtful, quietly attentive. We sat across from each other at the small dining table. The food was simple but full of flavor. We talked less than usual. It was as if we both knew the words weren't what mattered anymore. After dinner, we moved to the couch. A single lamp lit the room, casting long shadows. I don't remember exactly how we ended up leaning into each other, how his hand found mine again, or how our shoulders touched. But eventually they did, and it was like sinking into something familiar and new at the same time. He looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to stay." "I know," I said. And then I kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't fiery or desperate. It was slow, searching, and filled with everything we hadn't said. When we pulled apart, there were tears in my eyes, not from guilt, but from the overwhelming flood of feeling that had long been dammed inside me. We didn't go further that night. I left before midnight, driving through the quiet streets with the window cracked, letting the cold air hit my skin. I needed to feel something real, something sharp, something alive. When I got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time. The porch light Roger had left on glowed like a silent question. Inside, I undressed slowly, climbed into bed, and faced the wall. Roger stirred. "You okay?" "Just tired," I whispered. But I wasn't tired. I was wide awake in the middle of my life, realizing that something had shifted, not just in my marriage, not just with David, but inside me. And whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. The days that followed felt like walking through water. Everything slow, heavy, each moment echoing with the memory of that night. I went about my usual routines: grocery shopping, folding laundry, chatting with neighbors over hedges. But underneath the calm surface, something in me was changing. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was deciding. David didn't message right away. I think we both needed air, space, time to let the moment settle. Still, I checked my phone more often than I'd admit. I replayed that kiss over and over, not because it was forbidden, but because of what it awoke in me. It wasn't about desire. It was about recognition. On the third day, I finally reached out. "I'm thinking about that night," I wrote, not with regret, just with my eyes more open than they've been in years. His reply came not long after. "Me too. Would you meet me again?" We chose a quiet trail near the lake, one that curved gently along the water's edge, and was usually empty on weekday mornings. I wore my hair down, though I normally tied it back for walks. I told myself it wasn't for him, but it was. He was already there when I arrived, leaning against the wooden fence that overlooked the lake, a thermos in his hands. His smile was gentle, unsure. Like he didn't want to assume too much. I loved that about him. His caution, his respect, his unwillingness to take more than what was offered. We walked side by side for a while, not touching, just listening to the soft crunch of leaves beneath our shoes and the rustle of wind in the trees. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking about what this is, what we're doing, and I'm not sure I have an answer." "Me neither," I said quietly. "But I do know I feel more like myself around you than I have in a long time." He stopped walking, turned to me. "Are you happy, Emily?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it nearly undid me. I looked out across the water, the surface glinting with early sunlight. "I love my husband," I said, choosing each word with care. "He's good. He's steady. We have history, a family. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a woman and became a function, a role, wife, mother, host, planner. I'm not unhappy, but I'm not exactly whole either." David nodded slowly, eyes on mine. "I felt that too. Different shape, maybe, but the same ache." We sat on a bench beneath a weeping willow, its long green arms swaying around us like a curtain. For a while we said nothing, just breathed the same air. Then, his voice barely above the breeze, he asked, "What do we do now?" It was the question I had been circling for days. What did we do now? Keep meeting in hidden places, slipping between lines? Or stop before something unfixable happened? "I don't want to hurt Roger," I said. "He doesn't deserve that." David looked at me, his expression soft. "Then maybe this has to be enough." what we've shared, what we felt. Maybe it was just meant to wake us up, not carry us away. I nodded, but my chest ached with the weight of it. Still, we both knew he was right. We stood, slowly walking back toward the trailhead. As we neared the end, he reached for my hand, not to pull me close, not to possess me, but to thank me. For seeing him, for letting him see me. I squeezed his hand back, tears stinging behind my eyes. No matter what happens next, I whispered, I'm grateful for you. For this. For remembering I'm still someone. He smiled, a real smile, tinged with sadness but full of meaning. You are someone, Emily. You always have been. Don't ever let the world make you forget. We didn't kiss. We didn't make promises. We simply let go. That night, I told Roger I wanted to take a short trip alone. Just a weekend. Some space to clear my thoughts. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. Are you sure everything's okay? I hesitated, then said, I just need to reconnect with myself a bit. I feel like I've been on autopilot. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. Okay, I trust you. Those words stayed with me the entire drive to the cabin I'd rented, 2 hours away, tucked in the woods by a lake, quiet and clean. I brought a journal, a few old books, no distractions. I didn't bring David, not in body, but in spirit, he was there. In the way I slowed down, in the way I asked myself what I wanted without apologizing. By the second day, I began to write again. Not just lists or schedules, but thoughts, feelings, dreams. I wrote about my 20-year-old self, the one who used to sketch poems on napkins and believed in wonder. I wrote about the years that shaped me, the compromises I made, the beauty I built. And I wrote about David, not as a fantasy or temptation, but as a mirror that reminded me I was still more than I'd allowed myself to be. When I returned home, Roger was waiting at the door, arms folded, a concerned look on his face. Feel better? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I really do. He kissed my cheek. I missed you. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had something to bring back, not just stories of errands or chores, but something of me. That night, I told him I wanted us to talk more. To really talk. I didn't tell him everything. Some truths are quiet and personal. But I did tell him I wanted to feel closer again. That I missed the parts of us that used to surprise each other. He held my hand, the way David had, and said, Then let's try. And so we did. The weeks that followed were slow, steady, deliberate in a way I hadn't expected. Roger and I began to talk differently. Not constantly, not always deeply, but with more presence. We'd sit out on the porch after dinner, something we hadn't done since the boys moved out. He'd ask me about the books I was reading, and I'd ask him about the parts of his job that didn't just involve numbers and reports. Sometimes we held hands. Sometimes we just sat quietly and let the sounds of evening fill the gaps. I didn't see David again after that walk. We exchanged one more message, brief, warm, and full of unspoken things. Thank you for waking something in me, I wrote. His reply came quickly. It was always there. You just needed someone to remind you. Be well, Emily. And that was it. I didn't delete his number. I didn't block it either. I simply let it stay in my phone like a leaf tucked between the pages of an old book, fragile, still, and no longer needed to be held every day to matter. One morning, I stood in front of my closet and chose a dress I hadn't worn in years, deep blue with soft fabric that hugged me gently. I looked at myself in the mirror. The lines on my face hadn't disappeared, My body hadn't magically returned to what it was at 30. But there was something different about the way I stood, the way I regarded myself. I wasn't waiting for life to remind me I was still here. I knew I was. Roger noticed the change too. Not all at once, but in small ways. He started complimenting me again. Simple things like, "That color looks nice on you," or "You smell good tonight." He reached for my hand when we walked down the grocery aisle, something he hadn't done since before smartphones filled our palms. We began cooking together more, even if it was just pasta on a Tuesday. He'd pour the wine, I'd chop the garlic, and we'd play old music from our early years. James Taylor, Bonnie Raitt, Van Morrison. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. But it was real, intentional. One evening, as we stood at the sink doing dishes, he said, "You seem different lately." Not in a bad way, just lighter. I dried my hands slowly. "I've been thinking more about what I need, not just what I do." He looked at me serious. "And what do you need?" That question hit me more deeply than he probably meant it to. I reached out and placed my hand on his chest, where I could feel the steady beat beneath his shirt. To be seen. To feel like I matter beyond the chores and the roles. To be more than just someone who keeps things running. He nodded. "You do matter. I'm sorry if I forgot to show that." "I forgot to," I said softly. "I forgot myself for a while." That night, he took more time with me. Not in a rushed, obligatory way, but as someone rediscovering a familiar place with new eyes. And I let myself receive it. Not as proof. Not as apology, but as choice. A choice to open up, to trust, to believe that it's not too late to feel new things in old places. As the seasons began to shift, summer curling slowly into early fall, I felt something settle inside me. Not a conclusion, but a quiet truth. What happened with David wasn't something to erase or regret. It was a pivot. A candle lit in a room I hadn't walked into in years. Sometimes we meet people not to keep them, but to remember ourselves in their presence. I never told Roger everything. But I also never let what happened turn into something shameful. I took it in, absorbed it, and let it shape me, not into someone else, but back into someone I'd once been. Someone curious. Someone alive. Someone unfinished. In the end, what changed everything wasn't just that one evening with David. It was the realization that change was possible. That being seen again, truly seen, doesn't require abandoning everything you've built. It simply means showing up differently. Now, when I look at Roger, I don't just see my husband. I see the man who once made me laugh until I cried in the back of a diner booth, who once danced barefoot with me in the kitchen while pasta boiled over on the stove, and I try to show him the version of me that used to dance without being asked. And when I think of David on quiet walks, or when the light hits the trees just so, I send him a silent thank you for being the unexpected pause in the middle of my life, for reminding me that there's always more to feel, and most of all, for waking me up just when I thought I was done dreaming.